I've been helping people build families for almost 20 years, helping people who want to conceive with donor sperm. And you've been on the other end, helping people pick donors and learn about that whole process. So I'm really excited to ask you questions that my patients ask me all the time. And quite honestly, it should be very straightforward. Angelo and I work very closely together, and I'm very much like, I'm just going to reach out to Angelo and he'll answer those questions. So thank you very much.
You, of course, happy to do it anytime.
Welcome to Baby or Bust, the podcast where we explore all things fertility. Each week, we are going to learn from either interviews with experts in the field, discussions with people who've experienced their own family building journey, or an in-depth answer to some common questions. You're going to notice a little bit of difference in the format of Baby or Bust. The first 2 seasons were incredible. I'm forever thankful to the producers, Mark Ramsey and Jamie Solis, for their incredible guidance and fantastic interviews that we did. And I'm looking forward to a little bit of a different format for the show. We're going to be dedicated to giving you weekly content. And so we're still going to continue with interviews. I love connecting with people and asking questions and learning. But we also know, and you have asked for in-depth conversations with very specific topics. So we are going to give you weekly content. Some of it's going to be interviews, of course, but we're also going to make sure that we're going in depth where I am just going through answering your questions about very specific topics in the fertility field. I have a new producer, Shannon Perry from Audiotocracy, and she is going to be helping so much through this process. We still have our incredible friends at Seattle Sperm Bank and Greg Moga helping to support and sponsor the show. So still the same host, Dr. Lora Shahine. Be sure and connect with me on Instagram, on TikTok, on YouTube, and feel free to send me an email at hello@drlorashahine.com with topics that you want me to cover and with people that you'd like me to interview. This is an incredible opportunity to connect with you, and I am so excited about our first show in this new format. Today, we're going to be speaking to an expert in the field of using donor sperm. Angelo Allard is the General Supervisor of the Seattle Sperm Bank, and he is here to share his incredible knowledge and experience with screening donors, answering patient questions, and building families in this beautiful way. I love speaking with Angelo. We have worked together and shared patients for many years. He has been working at Seattle Sperm Bank for almost 15 years. He's personally helped answer my own questions about donor sperm. He's helped many of my patients. What I love about Angelo is his passion for what he does. He loves helping people find the right donor and building their family in this beautiful way. So let's listen to Angelo. I can't wait for you to hear this interview. Welcome, Angelo Allard. It is so good to have you on the podcast. Thank you for being here.
Absolutely. So happy to be here.
Tell me a little bit about your role and what you do at Seattle Sperm Bank.
Sure. So I am the General Supervisor at Seattle Sperm Bank, and it's probably easier to ask what I don't do there. I don't do finances, I don't do marketing, and I don't typically do donor recruitment. But everything from operations to technical writing, staffing, firing, hiring, training, and compliance with the FDA. So basically everything that is related to operations and keeping the business going.
Well, that's pretty amazing because it is one of the most well-respected and largest sperm banks in the country.
Thank you.
And you have been there since almost the beginning, right?
Right. Yeah. We opened in 2008, and I've been with the company since 2010.
That just makes me want to ask questions about your perspective. You know, I've been helping people build families for almost 20 years, helping people who want to conceive with donor sperm. And you've been on the other end, helping people pick donors and learn about that whole process. So I'm really excited to ask you questions that my patients ask me all the time. And quite honestly, it should be very straightforward. Angelo and I work very closely together, and I'm very much like, I'm just going to reach out to Angelo and he'll answer those questions. So thank you very much.
You, of course, happy to do it anytime.
Patients often really start asking questions about how you screen donors. Like you might have someone who is interested in donating and comes to you, maybe excited to help people build families this way.
Sure.
But what are the screening process? What kind of tests are you doing?
It's intense. I mean, the 35,000-foot overview is for every 1,000 individuals who apply online to become a donor, 9 are qualified. So that is primarily due to the screening and checking and testing that we do. And as you can imagine, it's a funnel, right? So you have the first layer of those seeking to be donors, they apply online. And then those that visit. And then those that visit whose sperm quality is good enough to make it through our processing, our freezing, our thawing. Then those individuals who then make it through the family medical history check, the consenting, the background check, the psychological assessment, the counseling. And then you're left with that smallest pool of donors who then go on to a physical exam, blood testing, infectious disease testing, and genetic testing. And then from that pool, it's an even smaller number. So that's where you get from the 1,000 applicants all the way down to the 9 that make it in the program.
That's pretty incredible.
Yeah.
And part of the process is having this testing, giving a sample, and then coming back 6 months later to get testing again.
Yeah.
So that quarantine process means you have people that are dedicated to the process, not just walking in off the street and saying, hey, I want to get a quick cash.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yeah. It is not a, hey, I show up and I earn supplemental income on day one.
So tell me, Angelo, what would kick somebody out of the program? So they are interested, they can follow directions, their sperm count is great. Then what would kick them out?
So we'll start with the obvious. Positive infectious testing would disqualify you from the program. There are certain genetic testing carrier conditions that would disqualify you, even though that you're just a carrier.
So these are things that you wouldn't want to pass on to a child.
Absolutely.
A genetic condition you wouldn't want to pass on. So infectious issues, genetic issues, what else?
And then we can get into more of the social issues. Obviously, we interact with an incredible spectrum of recipients, from traditional families to non-traditional families and everything in between. And any donor that displays a social hesitation to their specimens being used for that entire spectrum of families, we don't really want to have in the program. We want to make sure that any donor that enters our program is willing to help every and any family that approaches us for starting their journey.
I hadn't really thought about that, but that makes sense. Like someone could say, I really want to help build families of a certain faith or of a certain non-LGBTQ or only single moms or something. And you're saying, let's be open to all type of family building.
Absolutely. And it's not that I don't want to honor the donor's wishes. It's just that because of the recipient demographic or demographics that we serve, it's very hard to manage those social structures. Another thing that can disqualify a donor is the psychological health assessment.
I wanted to ask you about this. This is really sensitive. I'm sure you know about the donor that was found out to have schizophrenia later in life, and my patients ask me about that.
What a terrible situation.
And just to clarify, that was not at Seattle Sperm Bank.
I'd love to say that those situations are 100% avoidable. They're 99% avoidable, and that one could have been avoided.
Well, how do you reassure a patient that
Sure.
says, hey, how do you do a psychological eval?
Yeah, so we have a PhD psychologist who meets with our donors, and they perform a health assessment. It's about a 45 to 60-minute interview where questions are presented to the potential donor about their inhibitions, their fears and anxieties, their desires, their motivations. And it's an opportunity for someone who is trained, like our counselor is, to read into the situation and produce an assessment based on that interview. There are other tools that can be used for psychological health assessments, such as standardized testing. However, and there's been some research to indicate that ASRM agrees, the American Society for Reproductive Medicine, that these standardized tests are not well suited for gamete donors, and that you learn and are able to utilize information more from a personalized interview than a standardized test.
I agree. I think when you first said the word psychological eval, I immediately thought to myself, is this a test that they're just doing online, or is it an actual interview? Because I do think there's so many social cues, and you can delve into a question a little bit deeper if it's a one-on-one
Absolutely.
interview rather than just filling some bubbles out on a piece of paper. So that's fascinating. I will say that just in general, a lot of times when sperm donation or fertility treatment in general is shared on tabloids and in the news, it's really these very difficult situations that have happened. And my patients often ask me, and I'd love to know how you answer, how do you guarantee what you're able to put out there on the website, what you've learned about the donor? And I know guarantee is a very strong word, but I mean, how do you build that trust with the recipients that are purchasing the donor sperm, and how do you reassure them that these tests and you're doing the best that you can?
Yeah. I always say that you're either going to be a victim or a participant in transparency. You might try to get away with not being transparent, but eventually you'll become the victim. So just be transparent, be a participant. The other thing I'll say is that much like I can't guarantee that you will get pregnant, that you will have a birth, I really can't, with 100% assurance, guarantee anything. I can promise you that we're doing all of the checks that we say we're doing. I can promise you that we're doing all the screening and testing that we say we're doing. But I really cannot guarantee anything. And as you can imagine, let's just take the family medical history as an example. So donor 1234, potential donor comes into our facility and says, I want to be a donor. And we get to the point where we're going to do a family medical history check. Do I have the opportunity to speak to their parents?
No.
Their siblings? Their grandparents? No. Mm-hmm. That being said, yes, it's self-reported by the donor, but if you put that family medical history that is self-reported by the donor into context with their physical examination, blood testing, infectious disease testing, genetic testing, psychological health assessment, criminal background check, you start putting this picture together, it either lines up or it doesn't. So what I can promise is that we are doing the check, screening, and testing, but I don't have the ability to guarantee anything.
That's a lot.
It's tough.
It's tough. One thing that you talked about is the quantity of sperm that needs to be in a sample in order to qualify someone. So we keep hearing in the news that sperm counts are declining around the world. Are you seeing that in your, 14, 15 years at the Seattle Sperm Bank? Are you guys seeing this trend?
Yes. Yeah. When I first joined the company in 2010, I actually was working in the lab. I wasn't doing operations or managing. I was an andrologist in the lab. And I remember at that point in time, it wasn't uncommon for me to have a donor specimen that I would put on our hemocytometer to do the counting, that I'd have to dilute just the count. Mm-hmm. It would be so concentrated. It looked like an ocean on the slide. Back then in 2010 to 2012, our rough average of total modal count was probably, of donors we were accepting into the program, probably 200 or greater, 200 million or greater. Mm-hmm. And now it's right around 120 or 130.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I'll just say as a fertility doctor, I would say, we call a normal sperm count over 20 million per milliliter. And that's pretty much what we see. Like, I rarely see counts in the 100 million and maybe once over 200 million. So that is, but I'm seeing people who are having trouble conceiving and, they're going to be a certain population. But that's really interesting.
It is. I mean, for example, 10 years ago, I'd have donors that could have a total modal count of over 600, 700 million, a billion. And now if I see anything over 300 million, that's the abnormality. So it's dropped quite a bit just in 13, 14 years.
Okay.
I was actually at a talk this last week in Colorado where the presenter was discussing the decline in fertility rates, especially among men. And there's a lot more that goes into actual fertility potential than just total modal count, but it is a very good indicator. And he doesn't believe, you hear all these doomsday articles and media pieces that say, we're going to get to zero someday. And what's the movie? Children of Men. Terrific movie. Mm-hmm. It's not going to happen, but are we on a linear decline? We absolutely are. But as most curves will go, it will flatten out. Mm-hmm. But it's not very optimistic.
Yeah, it's something to pay attention to for sure. Mm-hmm. I have one more question about screening. Mm-hmm. My patients often ask me about regulation. Mm-hmm. I know the type of screening that Seattle Sperm Bank does, and I work with other sperm banks as well, and I see some differences as far as what genetic screening is done or what type of psychological eval, et cetera. And my patients ask, and I'm curious too, what type of oversight is out there with sperm banks?
Yeah.
And does it come from the American Society of Reproductive Medicine or the FDA?
So the minimal blueprint that's provided by the FDA is screening, testing, donor eligibility determination, rules that, and guidelines that are set for distribution purposes, storage purposes, safety purposes, et cetera.
And not passing on communicable disease, labeling the
Correct.
tissue.
Storage of the tissue. And then with that minimal blueprint, you can then build a scaffolding on top of it that goes through some of the more social constructs of, criminal background checks, counseling, psychological health evaluations. Another aspect to our program in specific is that we are an open ID program only, meaning we don't have any anonymous donors. And so the difference that provides is the type of donor you bring in, the type of individual that you bring into the program understands that though they may be there to earn some supplemental income, they absolutely will be contacted in the future by at least one of their offspring, if not more.
Yeah.
So it changes the mindset and the dedication and commitment of that individual for being a part of our program.
Got it.
It raises the caliber quite a bit. Everything that's above and beyond the infectious testing, the screening, everything that's required in eligibility determination as set forth by the FDA, everything that's on top of that is something that we have self-imposed.
Mm-hmm. So the only type of regulation that's out there is really coming from the FDA to help with the infectious disease, storing of tissue, chain of command, identification. But all of the other things that you include, like genetic screening, criminal background checks, detailed personal interviews with psychological eval, that is really coming from your own desire to help your recipients the best. It is not coming from a governing body.
That's correct.
Now I want to move more towards from the patient's perspective, how they choose donors and kind of go into that.
The fun part.
Yeah, the fun part.
Could be overwhelming, but it's fun.
Yeah. So when I have a patient who's looking for donor sperm, I often encourage them to kind of go to the website and start just getting familiar with it. And can you walk through what they could expect? What are they going to find out about a donor when they're trying to make this selection?
Sure. The best way that I've put it is that in most cases, those seeking donor sperm will know more about their donor than they would ever know about their partner. For example, I don't know my wife's blood type. I don't. And that's just a very easy example, but there's several of those types of examples that you will end up knowing more about your sperm donor than you would your partner. And so because of that, it can be somewhat overwhelming. There's so much information. How do I really make my choice? And one of the things that I always tell to recipients and to really even new staff that I hire, I say, our client services department, we're not a sales organization. We don't have targets or quotas or bottom lines. They are not there to sell you donor sperm. They are there to help you find the right donor for you. It's really like a glorified question and answer department. And so what our company exists to do and what one of our main missions is to present a situation or an interaction with our recipients or potential recipients that helps them find the best donor for them. And you have different demographics and kind of maybe buckets of clientele that will approach your business or our business. And they'll say, well, I have no idea what I'm looking for. Or that's one end of the spectrum. And the other end is, I know exactly what I'm looking for, and I need your help finding these 10 criteria or 30 criteria. And we're always very honest. Sometimes I'm happy to say that, yeah, your 30 criteria we have. Or sometimes it's very hard for me to say, but honest to say, you had 3 main criteria, and I have 0 donors that meet all 3.
Yeah.
So, and there's just this incredible and beautiful spectrum of what people are looking for in the donor. And that's really what we exist to do. And I think one of the things that really sets us apart from some of our other competitors is that we know our donors. They are not just numbers to us. I mean, I could give you so many examples, but we really know our donors. And so when you call and say, hey, can you tell me more about donor 1234? Say, yes, absolutely. Above and beyond what you're seeing in their extended profile document, in their audio interview, here is some factoids or anecdotes about my interactions with the donor. And I think that really helps the potential recipient understand that this is not just somebody who is providing DNA. They're an actual human being who has emotions and personalities and intelligence.
What do they get to know about their donor? Do they get to see pictures?
Sure.
Do they get to read essays? How do they get to know this person that they're choosing?
Yeah, so we offer some additional documentation and images to help the recipients learn more about the donor. We have an extended donor profile, which is anywhere from 20 to 40 pages, depending on how many family members they have, to learn more about the donor's personal medical information, their education, occupation, allergies, etc., as well as similar information as it relates to their immediate family members. We provide childhood photos. We do not provide adult photos for our donors. We don't have adult photos because all of our donors are open ID. We try to give the donors as much anonymity up until age 18 of the offspring, where contact and the disappearance of that anonymity will occur. Now, in my opinion, and as I've seen the industry change, anonymity is kind of a farce anyways, but we try to provide that for the donors as much as possible. Other materials that we offer for our donors are audio interviews. It's anywhere from a 7 to 15-minute interview of the donor where you learn more about them, get to hear their voice and get a sense of their personality. We offer Kiersey temperament sorter results, which is kind of like a Myers-Briggs personality assessment, but the Kiersey just goes a little bit above and beyond just your typical Myers-Briggs. We also have a staff impression, what we think of the donor, that's written by staff that have interacted with the donor. We also provide a redacted copy of their genetic test results. So you can keep their genetic testing results, just the only thing we redact out of it is their date of birth for identifying purposes. We do also offer photo matching. If during your donor search, you want to provide photos of a family member, a friend, a celebrity that you want to have your donor match to as best as possible, we will absolutely do that. One of the questions we get is, as it relates to celebrity matching, we don't do just celebrity matching. You can't just send us an email and say, I want my donor to look like George Clooney. Well, guess what? I don't have George Clooney. And the truth is, I think it's a misrepresentation of the donor and a misrepresentation of your desire for me to try and answer that question even as honestly as I'm able. And so it's much easier and I think more reliable for you to send in photos and say, okay, this is the one that matches the best to the photos that you send.
That's great. So do you have any personal stories about recipient just being really nervous about the process and telling you a few things that they're looking for and then just finding this incredible match?
Sure. So this would have been about 2014. It was one of my favorite stories. There was a recipient and her partner who had a very specific list of criteria and photos they wanted their donor matched to. Historically, when those situations would arise, I would get very nervous. I go, because again, I want to be as transparent as possible. And so I don't want to find myself in a situation where I'm going, this is an okay match. It just so happened, though, that one of the photos they presented was of their brother and one of the partner's brothers. And the brother was an absolute doppelganger for one of our donors. The only issue was their brother had brown eyes and this donor had blue eyes. I'm like, well, we have blue eyes. We were looking after blue eyes anyways. And so it was one of those situations where I was able to not only find a great match, but find something that was even above and beyond their match. And that doesn't always happen, but those memories really stick with you. I mean, we're talking 8-9 years later. I still remember, I'm not going to use their names, but I know their names. I know their children's names now.
Yeah. What happens when people just can't find the right donor that they're looking for?
I honestly tell them that we don't have the best match for them and that there's some other great companies in the United States that may be able to assist them.
Yeah.
Again, I never want to push donors on anyone. I want to try and find the best match for their family purposes.
What fears do you hear from people that are trying to match? What questions do they ask you?
Fears. I think it kind of all relates back to what we were talking about earlier with the guarantees. Will I get pregnant? Will my child be healthy? How do I make sure that the donor I use is the donor that produced my child? How do I make sure that the donor is safe and sound? So I think most of the fears really orbit this idea of guarantees. But some of the more common questions that we get about maybe being overwhelmed with the process is, where do I start? And where you start with is, and what my client services team and I would tell you is, come up with a list of the most important criteria that you want in your donor and hopefully in your child. And then let us help you. Let us review that list or the photos that you're going to provide for photo matching, and let us help narrow the list of 200 plus donors down to 10.
Mm-hmm.
And then if you don't like those 10, that's important data. Then we'll provide a different set of 10. But typically, we're able to narrow it down to a smaller list of donors that is much less overwhelming.
In helping people for years build families with donor sperm, I have just really enjoyed hearing the process of donor selection, and every one of my patients is different. I have some patients that really need all of the details, all of the information, all the voice, as many photos as possible, and they really appreciate being able to talk to your team about all of that personal data. And then I have a patient just last week that told me she basically had some girlfriends over. They had a couple of cocktails and they pulled up the website and they were kind of going through it together. And I mean, the patient takes it very seriously, but it was just sort of this no shame, no hiding it from their friends. She actually got her girlfriends involved in the process and made it really a joyful thing. And so
Sure.
I appreciate that you're saying that this is a really personalized process for every person that's coming in, because it's true. It's a really big, huge decision. So now we know how donors are screened and how strict that is. We know what the recipients learn when they go to the site. Now they're ready to buy.
Yeah.
And so this is also a really confusing topic because there's different types of sperm for sale. Like, can you explain a little bit about the different preparations?
Of course. Yeah, so we offer a total of 5 vial types. And those vial types are IUI, ICI, IUI-ART, ICI-ART, and ICSI. I'll explain those vial types. IUI is a washed specimen ready for IUI treatment, and in most cases, with most clinic protocols, will be ready for IVF treatment.
So IUI is intrauterine insemination.
That's correct.
And IVF is in vitro fertilization. So you could take this vial and just thaw it and use it in, what I do every day in intrauterine insemination to help somebody, just putting sperm into the uterus around the time of ovulation to try to get pregnant.
That's correct.
But you could also use that vial for IVF.
That's correct.
Okay,
Some clinics will have protocols that they need to prep above and beyond what we do, but most clinics that we work with closely know that our IUI quality is very good and can be used for IVF right away. An ICI is an unwashed vial, meaning that it is a raw ejaculate that has just had freeze media added to it so it can survive the freezing and thawing process. That vial type can be used directly for intracervical insemination, home insemination, or can be then prepped by a clinic for IUI or IVF. IUI-ART and ICI-ART are similar to their monikers in that IUI-ART are prepped and washed the exact same way as IUI, but have fewer total motile cells available in the thawed specimen. They're a little bit cheaper than the standards, and they're typically used for IVF. So IVF can be an expensive process. You don't need as many cells as you do for IUI. That is the most common vial type purchase for IVF.
Okay.
ICI-ART, same thing. Processed the same way as its predecessor, the ICI, but fewer total motile cells than a standard.
Just to explain, you don't need as much sperm to get pregnant when you're doing IVF because you've got these eggs in a lab and these sperm in a lab, and you can even help that process with ICSI, what you said, the intracytoplasmic sperm injection, where you can put one sperm into each. But when you're doing a home insemination or when you're doing an intrauterine insemination at our clinic, you really do need a good amount of motile sperm to cause a pregnancy. And I think that is a really important difference.
Yeah, by comparison, the cells needed for IVF or ICSI compared to intracervical or intrauterine insemination, the number is exponentially more. But realizing that you really don't need very many for IVF or ICSI.
Right. So, I do know when we thaw a sample for an intrauterine insemination, we do a count because most sperm banks will guarantee at least 10 million moving sperm in that sample,
That's right.
ready to go. And so that makes sense. What's the general count for this smaller amount?
Yeah, so the IUI standards, like you said, is 10 million motile or greater. For the IUI ARTs, it's going to be between 4 and 9. And for the ICSI specimens, it's going to be between 2 and 4.
Okay, and ICSI is that intracytoplasmic sperm injection. And I talk to my patients all the time. I mean, some people are doing IVF only because they have such significant male factor. Like there's just not enough sperm in the ejaculate in order to try to conceive, even with an intrauterine insemination. But I say, oh, well, if we get 10 eggs at the egg retrieval, we only need 10 sperm. So you're saying, and you can make that less expensive. Can you give me a ballpark for cost of these?
So standard IUI and ICI are $995 US. IUI and ICI ART are $850, and ICSI is $650.
Great. Thank you for clarifying that. Thank you for being transparent about
You're
that.
welcome.
I appreciate that. And then I get a lot of questions from my patients. Well, how many vials should I buy? And this is just really hard for me to answer.
This is a tough one.
What is your family goal? You know, not everybody gets pregnant with only one vial. Like, how do you?
So when I field that
help?
question, or
Yeah.
we field that question, the best way to address it is to actually ask some additional questions, saying, what treatment type are you undergoing? How many children would you like to have? What is financially feasible for you? Is there any ways that we can help you or assist you to make sure that you have enough vials for the way that you've answered your first 3 questions? And so what we see statistically is that the average purchase is just under 2 vials. It's like 1.8. So let's just call it 2 for easy math. The average transaction is 2 vials, but the average number of vials purchased before we get a pregnancy report is between 5 and 6. And that's because most people, especially in the U.S., the way the insurance works, et cetera, they're going to be pushed towards IUI first and then to IVF after so many failed attempts at IUI. And so the average number of vials purchased before we receive our pregnancy/birth report is between 5 and 6.
Okay.
If you consider that, and let's say you want to have 2 children in your family, we'd recommend 10 to 12 vials. That's not financially feasible for everybody to do at one transaction. And so, we try to be as transparent as possible and say, well, this donor is still actively donating. There should be more vials available in the future. Should you purchase just 2 or 3 now, there should be more available should you come back 6 months or a year from now. However, we always recommend that they get on a waiting list so that they can be notified when more vials do become available, like you mentioned earlier with the 6-month quarantine that every specimen has to be in before it can be released. So there's a lot of tips and advice we can give, and it's honestly easier to give that advice in a conversation than putting it amongst the 6th paragraph of things you should know.
Yeah.
It becomes too long, didn't read. And so I think that the best thing that we can do in these interactions where people say, how many vials should I buy, is hear more from them and then give the best advice possible without making them decipher it from paragraph 10.
Yeah. I just have had some really tough conversations with patients that look back and say, I wish I had bought
It's the worst.
more. It's the worst. And it's really hard because, you can change your mind about your family size. And a lot of people really like to have that genetic connection between the kids. But it is really hard because it's hard to look forward. There's sometimes where people have been able to buy a lot of vials up front and then keep them actually at the sperm bank. And then if they don't use them,
we offer a buyback, yeah.
Yeah. How does that work?
So any vials that a recipient or family purchases that never leaves our facility, that is within 2 years since the purchase date, we will buy back at 50% of the original purchase price.
That's great. So is there anonymity anymore? You've mentioned a little bit about like open ID and being open and trying to respect your donor's anonymity. But in the day and age of, home genetic testing, I mean, how do you talk to donors about that?
We're going to do our best to protect your anonymity. We're not going to have your identifying details listed anywhere. But in the world of DNA testing, social media, reverse image lookup on Google, I can't guarantee anything.
And I've just seen it change so much in my own career, Angelo. So I remember, 15 years ago, just there was no at-home genetic testing, and the whole feeling in the field was, well, we need to keep everything anonymous because if it's not completely anonymous, we're not going to find donors willing to donate, and then we won't be able to help people build families in this way because it's an amazing way to build families. And then it was also assumed by a lot of people in the field that recipients really wanted to keep it anonymous. And I've definitely seen that change over time and people trying to want to find each other through these donor registries and people making contact and actually really wanting that. And I don't think that that's the right thing for everyone. And but I definitely have seen the time change. Like, question for you, in this shift of lack of anonymity, have you personally seen fewer donors wanting to apply and be a part of this process?
No.
So, I mean, that goes against what people assumed for so long. And I just really appreciate your saying that because I think it's just on the verge of just getting more and more open. And just the fact that you even only accept people that are willing to make contact in the future, I just think that I don't know where it's going, but I just think it's so different than what I expected when I started.
I don't know where it's going either. I think I have some ideas where it stemmed from. I think the more donor-conceived people that became of age where they could communicate their experiences, I think has changed what we as gamete banks want to make sure that we do better going forward. I think it also stems from the world of social media and where things are much more transparent and open to the public than they ever have been prior to the year 2007.
Mm-hmm.
DNA testing, I think, there's some companies that are out there really for the betterment of the understanding of your health history concerns. And there's also some companies that are out there just to sell your data. Beware for those of you who are doing DNA tests. So I think there's a lot of stems and roots that kind of led to where it is today. But where it's going is anybody's guess. Common
question for my patients. How are limits set on the number of children, on the number of families? What's going on in the United States and elsewhere?
Sure. So our policy is that we limit our donors to 25 families in the United States, and then we follow all other country-specific government-mandated limits. The U.S. doesn't have a government-mandated limit. If you were to listen to American Society for Reproductive Medicine, which is a guidance, they say that they are comfortable with 10 families for every population density of 800,000. That would mean 10 families for every metropolis in the United States. Well, there's 44 of those in the United States.
Yeah.
So ASRM would be fine with 440 families in the United States.
Yeah, that's a lot more than 25.
That's a no.
Right.
That's a no for us.
Yeah.
So we limit it to 25 families in the United States, and then we follow all other country-specific government-mandated limitations.
Can you give me some examples of countries?
Sure. In the UK, it's 10 families. In Australia, it's either 10 or 5 families, depending on the state that you're in. And it's either an Australia limit or a worldwide limit, depending on the state you're in. In Denmark, it's 12. Sweden, it's 6. Hong Kong, it's 3.
How are these numbers calculated? I mean, where is that guideline coming from? Is it the chances that, siblings would find each other?
I can tell you that in the UK, their guideline is based on consanguinity statistical rates.
And that means same bloodline.
Yeah, same bloodline, inappropriate relations, as well as what they believed based on the limited data that was available in 2004 to say what is socially acceptable or ethically acceptable. We have much more data on that now. But, these regulations that were written across Europe, be it 2002, 2004, 2007, they did their best with the data that they had available.
How did you guys come up with 25?
It's a great question. When we looked at what some of the other regulations of population sizes around the world, so if you look at London, or the UK, their overall population is much smaller than the United States, but the UK is the size of Washington State. Right. So we kind of just use the extrapolation of total population density to their regulation and then applying that to the population density across the United States and saying, this is what it allows for, but this is what we're comfortable with.
Do you guys track where these births happen?
Yes.
Because, I know we're a mobile population, but if you have 25 families and they're all in Seattle, that would be very different.
Be very different. Yeah. No, we also do further limit it to 10 families per population density of 800,000.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I really appreciate your being transparent
You're welcome.
about that. Well, I've got some questions from Instagram.
Here we go.
I put out there, and I just said, hey, help me help you. I put this on my Instagram story, and I just said, I'm going to be speaking to a head of a sperm bank. Like, what kind of questions do you have?
Sure.
So I got a couple. So Lisa wanted to ask, how do you appeal to non-white men to donate? And I have definitely heard about coverage and lack of options from not just your sperm bank, but a lot.
So, first off, we definitely recognize that this is an issue. It's a big challenge for those recipients seeking non-white ethnicities. And the best way that I can tell you the truth of the matter before I get into some details is that we don't specifically market to one type of donor. We market to all donors. And if anything, we put more efforts because of this challenge that we recognize. We put more efforts into marketing for non-white ethnicities. But even given that, because of either where our labs are located, for cultural issues, for social issues, for socioeconomic issues, the challenge still seems to be very difficult to overcome in getting donors from those non-white ethnicities to even just visit our program. But we are working on it.
Shannon asked a really good question on Instagram. I personally have seen a change in questions that come up in my clinic as a fertility clinic after the Dobbs decision, after the overturn of Roe v. Wade. Mm-hmm. And I'm just curious, has anything changed on your end as a sperm bank?
Not directly. Fortunately, thankfully, those recipients' patients that are looking to undergo this fertility journey, it's kind of in direct juxtaposition of Roe v. Wade Dobbs. Not always. There's going to be situations that arise where individuals want to seek the end to a journey for whatever reason. So indirectly, there's been some murmurings, some difficulties and challenges that patients are undergoing. But by and large, those who are seeking gametes aren't necessarily affected by the decision directly. What I will say, though, is that based on the way that the decision or what the decision that was made, there's a lot of questions about non-traditional family rights. And so we get more questions about that. How do I declare my child's biological father? Mm-hmm. How do I get my partner to be on the birth certificate? If I'm a single mother, what does that mean if I go to apply for a passport or I need to get a visa for travel? Things like that. So I think that specific case has brought more questions around non-traditional family rights and the protection of their family and their children and their opportunities and things like that than the actual main issue of abortion.
Mm-hmm. So from Instagram, Sarah asked, if you find out a new piece of health information from a donor, after they've completed donating, but something that could impact the health of an offspring or a child, how do you get that information to the families?
Yeah. So for example, all of our donors, once they retire from our program, they're sent an annual survey to make sure that we have the most up-to-date medical information, family history medical information, personal medical information for the donor, as well as the most up-to-date contact information to make sure that when we're ready to liaise contact between donor and offspring, that we can make those things happen. And so when they provide that information, if there's anything that is medically significant that would present an increased risk to the health of the offspring, we'll notify the recipients. Another example is if a child's born from a donor where the child has an abnormality that is either partly because of the cause of the donor or cannot be ruled out, the donor can't be ruled out as the cause, we'll send what's called a medical update letter. The most common of these are very minor, saying, we had a child who was born with MCAD, which is medium chain coacyl dehydrogenase deficiency, and it's
like a metabolic. It's
and all children in all primary countries and Western countries they're tested for metabolic disorders at the time of birth, and you just have to modify the diet and it's okay. But what that means is that the donor is a carrier for that condition. So is the biological egg source was a carrier for the donor or a carrier for that condition. So we have to send out a medical update letter to all the recipients saying, hey, there's a 50% chance that your child is a carrier for this condition as well.
Okay.
Those are pretty minor. And then there are also examples of we can't rule out the donor as the cause, but we also don't know what the exact cause is. But we feel better about you having this information than not having this information.
Great. First of all, Angelo, I so appreciate everything that you have taught me today and shared. We love to end each podcast with a patient story. So can you think back to your years of helping build families, connecting people? Is there a patient story that sticks out to you?
It is very difficult to choose one, but I will choose one that is both heartbreaking and also very encouraging. So there was a family that I interacted with starting in 2012 who was very interested in a specific donor. And it was easy to see why. I mean, this donor to this day is in my top 5 of 1,500 donors I've interacted with. They had a child, thankfully, within 2 attempts of using this donor. And when they came back to acquire more units of this donor, the donor had passed away. It was a really unfortunate, sad situation. He was an avid outdoorsman and found himself in a position that he shouldn't have been solo in, and he lost his life. So, as we talked about earlier, we know that we have to have those specimens sit in a 6-month quarantine, and then we have to do follow-up testing to release those specimens from quarantine. Well, in a reproductive donor, there is no cadaveric testing that's allowed.
Let me just explain. You had this specimen sitting, but he's now passed away, so you can't do testing on him to release that sample. Is that what you mean?
That's right.
Oh, my goodness.
So I had...
You have it, but
I
it's
had
like...
over 90 units
Oh, my gosh.
awaiting the donor's final blood draw.
Oh, my...
And I have 20-plus families looking for units. For siblings. All these units were just going to be for siblings because he had already reached, roughly 19 families in the United States. And I had to have this conversation with this family that I had already built an incredible rapport with and just be honest with them and say, unfortunately, the donor had passed away. And as you can imagine, that's not only difficult because they can't have a sibling, but also because they've lost their opportunity for contact in the future.
Yeah.
So that's how this story starts out. And then as we progress, I contact the FDA to look for an exemption. Can I release these specimens? The donor had 15 blood draws, negative. Please, can we release these specimens for sibling purposes? No, they can just use a different donor. Because the FDA doesn't care about genetics. Just screening, testing, and eligibility. And so we began on this journey of, there were several recipients that had additional vials in storage that they were holding for their purposes. And I kind of ended up acting as a liaison between all these families.
Okay, so this is the same donor,
Yeah.
but it's just on hold for different families.
Mm-hmm.
But you'd already done the testing.
That's right.
Okay.
So I acted as kind of like this liaison or this broker going between families saying, have you completed your family? Even if you have or you think you have, do you want to save some units still? How many units, if possible or if willing, would you be willing to part with for the sake of this situation?
Wow.
And it ended up just, so I built this incredible rapport with this family that I started the story with, but then also interacted with all the families that still had vials. And it was beautiful. It was difficult. It turned out to be pretty great in the end. And even now, this family that I started the story with has 3 kids. So we found enough vials for them to have 3 kids. So, I could talk about this at great length, but that's the story that will probably stick with me forever.
Absolutely. Talk about community, talk about, really, truly helping build families and honestly going above and beyond because you could have just stuck with, well, the FDA, says this and not done that extra connection. That's
right.
Really, really beautiful.
Thank you.
Thank you for sharing that story.
Absolutely.
Thank you for being here today.
Of course.
I really appreciate it.
Yeah.
I hope you enjoyed this interview with Angelo Allard today as much as I did. I appreciate the complexity of this family building option. Donor sperm is an amazing way to build a family for many different reasons, but it is full of questions and fears and just an ever-changing world of how much open identity, how much families should come together. There's no easy answer because everyone is unique, just like everyone is looking for that unique donor that's right for their family. So I appreciate Angelo's insight into this and his passion for what he does. And it was just an incredible conversation. I really hope you enjoyed it. I want to thank our friends and colleagues at Seattle Sperm Bank for sponsoring the show, and really appreciate our producer, Shannon Perry. This is your host, Dr. Lora Shahine. See you next week when we interview the author of Fertility Rules, Leslie Schrock. And until then, wishing you love, luck, and pineapples.